everybody. This is Brendan Boland from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group, and you are with Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live. Welcome to the show, everybody. It is a blustery Wednesday night here in Wisconsin with kind of a spit and rain out and just not a nice day, but apparently it's nice everywhere else in the country, or so people tell me. We have a great show for you tonight, and somebody who I've wanted to have on the show for a long time. Primarily because I had never met him, and somebody I really wanted to meet. And tonight's guest, all the way from, I think, his adoptive home out on the East Coast in Maryland, is it?
Yep, in Maryland.
Erik Petkovic. He is the author of a number of books on Lake Erie diving, Lake Erie tech diving. He's been around for a long time. And he and I, for some reason, our paths just never crossed, even though we're kind of hanging in the same circles. So, Erik, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And it's amazing how we haven't crossed paths, considering we know the same people, we've hit up the same places, we've lived in some of the same places. But I appreciate you having me on. It's good meeting you virtually, and hopefully, when it's all over, we can do it in person.
You bet. You bet. We met last night when we were doing our vetting, and we were amazed. You know, we were both in Milwaukee at the same time. And both involved in some of the same projects, and we just didn't know it. You know,
right?
And we had a great conversation. You know, the vetting session probably went twice as long as it needed to. So excited to have Erik with us tonight. I got a couple of housekeeping things I want to take care of before we dive in. Pun intended. All right. So I did some things this week that I want to share with everybody. Before I dive in, I want to mention too, if you're online, thank you for posting the questions. Erik, would you prefer to have people just post questions throughout or wait till the end?
Either or. I'm pretty informal, so it doesn't really matter to me. However you want to do it.
So throw the questions in as you go. All right. So a couple of things I wanted to cover first. We have some great shows lined up for you every week here. Next week, we've got Mark Sprang, the archivist from the Historical Collections of the Great Lakes at Bowling Green State University. That is one of the most important repositories of Great Lakes maritime history archival material in the country. It was established by Rick Wright, just a giant in the Great Lakes maritime history world, followed up by Bob Graham, another major figure in Great Lakes maritime history, and now taking over with his able hands is Mark Sprang. So we're so excited to have Mark on to tell us about Bowling Green State University's Historical Collections of the Great Lakes and their Center for Archival Collections. It's a wonderful place to do research. And just recently signed after that, we will have Valerie Van Heest from Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates with us. Valerie has been one of the leading figures in Great Lakes shipwreck research since I was a young man, probably going on 40 years. Valerie has been one of the leaders in Great Lakes shipwreck research, not just in, on this side of the lakes. She started out in Chicago, but then went over to Michigan and founded the Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates after having a seminal role in the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago and her work with Clive Cussler. So it should be a wonderful show. Please tune in. A couple other things that I need to talk about. People have been asking if I would post some guidelines for our community. Just generally, it's been pretty loosey-goosey, but we've got over 2,000 members now. And so I put up some suggestions for folks just to let people know what our group's about and sort of our guiding principles. A couple of things. I asked on there, particularly about the sport diving photos. If every sport diver posted their photos on our group would become deluged with sport diving photos. There are thousands of sport divers on the Great Lakes. So I asked if you could, limit the number of photos of well-known tourist wrecks in the underwater preserves. What we're really looking to do is post information about new discoveries, about new information, new research, or new findings. So if by all means, if you see something on one of those wrecks in one of the preserves and you've seen that it suddenly collapsed, or you found some new information on it, or it's a wreck that no one's ever gotten good clear video of or good clear stills of, feel free to post it, of course. but be judicious. Obviously, we don't want to become a site of just I went diving today pictures. All right. A couple other things. I just kicked off a new initiative, the Research Challenge, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group Research Challenge. Every month, I'm going to post a new Great Lakes mystery that's not solved, and we're going to take a crack at it. And I'll give out an award if somebody makes a significant dent in it or actually solves it. And we'll do an episode of Great Lakes Shipwrecks live about it. So this month is the mystery of the schooner Blackhawk, which vanished on Lake Michigan in 1847, or did it? So read through, and if you want to take a stab at it, please do. All right. So that's our housekeeping. So Erik, as we were talking, one of the things that I really noticed about you is just how much we had in common in terms of our interests and our backgrounds. And it always makes me wonder, again, I know how I got involved in this sort of stuff, but I wonder how you did. What makes a guy get involved in Great Lakes maritime history and shipwreck diving to the extent that you have, and literally make it a focal point. Why don't you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to switch over and I'm going to present my PowerPoint here.
Sounds good.
It'll be, hopefully I did this right. Which I
can see it. It's up.
Okay. Let's see.
There we go.
All right, good. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So this is what did it for me. 1986, December. So I was born September 1st of 1979, and September 1st of 1985, when I was 6, is when Bob Ballard discovered Titanic. The first issue of National Geographic that Titanic made the cover of was the December of 1985 issue. However, this was the issue. This one from 1986 was the one that really, really intrigued me. And this is what made me want to explore the depths and really wanted me to be a diver, was this scene of Alvin looking in the window at Titanic, at 12,500 feet below the surface. I first saw this when I was visiting my aunt and uncle's house in Pennsylvania, and he had it out, and I looked at it, and that was it. And I was hooked, and I always wanted to be a diver ever since. And also, I grew up in Euclid, Ohio, so just east of Cleveland, and literally lived 3 or 4 houses away from Lake Erie. So I can hear the wave action every night. I was at the lake every single day growing up, every day, including the winter, was always on the Lake Erie. And it was one of those things where it just intrigued me, like, what is out there? And I always remember this cover of Nat Geo. And that really intrigued me and really brought out the kind of exploration side of me and really got me intrigued into what else was out there, especially in Lake Erie. And growing up on Lake Erie and being, from Cleveland, you always hear the jokes about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, so on and so forth. But I knew there had to be more out there than just a little bit of fish and, a garbage lake, as people used to call it. So that's what really got me intrigued, was that. And then I heard a story about the GP Griffith growing up. This wreck happened about 7 to 9 miles from my house, just off of Willowick, Ohio. And GP Griffith was originally built, it was a side wheel steamer, and it was built in 1847. It was only around for about 3 years before this happened. And the most remarkable thing about this is that over 300 people lost their life, only 600 yards from shore. And no help ever came. And only one woman out of all the women that were on board survived. All the other ones either burned to death or drowned. Unfortunately, only about 70 people out of almost 400 survived. And there's a little plaque in a park overlooking where this happened, and people were literally watching from shore, looking out at the fire. You can hear the screams and the cries from the people being burned to death and people drowning. And you literally had one of 4 fates. You either burned to death, you drowned because you couldn't swim, you drowned because you were weighted down with all of your worldly possessions, like your money, because you were most likely a German or Irish immigrant if you're on this ship. Or if you were a female, you drowned because the dresses were so heavy that you literally just couldn't make it to the surface. Or you drowned because you were pulled underwater from somebody else who couldn't swim. And it always amazed me that this happened, again, 600 yards from shore in 8 feet of water. So if you could literally just swim or float for 50 yards from where this occurred, you would have been in water deep enough or shallow enough to stand up in. But yet no help ever came. And that was just astounding to me. So the Titanic coupled with the GP Griffith really made me intrigued about what was under the water, not just in the oceans, but in the Great Lakes, which are as I always say in all my speeches, the Great Lakes are the single largest freshwater graveyard of ships in the world, as everybody here knows. And to me, this story of the Griffith and some of these other ones I heard on Lake Erie were the really ones that intrigued me and really got me going into diving and wanted me to learn how to dive. So much so that that's my first C card. And as you can tell, I look, not much has changed since 1996. Still the same amount of hair. It's just in a different place in gray. But this is what really wanted me to, this is what really got me to dive, were these two stories. And to think that Lake Erie, even though it's the shallowest of the Great Lakes and the second smallest of the Great Lakes, there is debate, but a lot of people seem to believe that there are more shipwrecks in Lake Erie than any of the other Great Lakes. Michigan and Lake Erie are pretty tied, either one or two. Not a good stat to have, either the first or second most shipwrecks in the lake. But that is what really, really intrigued me to start diving into this stuff, not only getting certified and going deeper and then getting, certified on its advanced training and start penetrating the shipbooks was really, as Indiana Jones says, right? If you want to be an archaeologist, you got to get into the library. And it's the same thing with wreck diving. If you really want to learn this history, if you really want to learn something about history and about these wrecks, you have to get into the library. And so I've spent an abundance of time over the last 10 or 15 years really, really looking for stuff that hasn't been found before and really hasn't been talked about too much. And that's what I really like doing, is doing the historical research. And for me, shipwrecks aren't just about diving down and going around the hull or seeing a pile of twisted metal or, a pile of wood on the bottom, right? It's much more than that. It's the human factor. It's what that captain was thinking, knowing that his ship was going to sink, doing everything he could to try to beach the ship, but knowing that he was never going to make it, or knowing what it must have been like for that mother holding her infant son or daughter in her hands on the ship like the Erie that was going down in the middle of the lake, and you couldn't swim and no help was coming and your ship was on fire. And you had a choice to make. You either threw your baby in the water to drown, or you held the baby in your arms to burn to death. But those were your choices. And that human factor is what's always kind of driven me to dive. So,
and you tell a great story too, Erik, particularly with these human interest stories. And I know when you and I were talking last night, one of the first things I asked you after we talked about sort of your background was, so what do you think of the MB2? Because obviously we can't talk about Lake Erie shipwrecks without talking about this gigantic railroad car ferry that has somehow managed to stay hidden in a lake that isn't much more than 70 feet deep throughout the lake. And this thing is the size of a football field, and it's still missing. Erik, how the heck can that be?
Right. It's amazing, right? So for those who don't know, I didn't include slides on this, but Lake Erie is, as I said, is the shallowest of the Great Lakes. And there's basically 3 distinct basins of Lake Erie. You have the western, the central, and eastern. The western basin encompasses obviously the west side of Lake Erie, but it encompasses Point Pelee going west, so the Lake Erie Island region. And that part of the lake, the western basin, only averages 24 feet, which is astounding. And considering that is a major shipping lane for all of the Great Lakes, because to get to or from the east to the west, or if you want to deliver those mundane trade goods from the upper Great Lakes to the ports of Cleveland, Erie, Buffalo, you had to go through Lake Erie. But it's astounding that the average depth over there in that part of the lake is only 24 feet. And then you have the Central Basin, which is typically what people think off of Cleveland, and that encompasses from about Erie, Pennsylvania, all the way west to Point Pelee, and that's also the widest part of the lake at about 58 miles wide. The average depth over there off of Cleveland is still only 60 feet deep. The deepest part of that lake is 85 feet, and there's a shipwreck there, but it's relatively shallow, and which explains why there's so many wrecks there, because it is so shallow. In that, when you have very significant weather storms, and as we all know, right, we're all fans of the Great Lakes, and in researching, that the Great Lakes is so large that it produces its own weather. So when you have these storms in Lake Erie, they literally come out of nowhere. And Lake Erie's geography isn't the best when it comes to storms, because it is basically it's horizontal, so everything blows from west to east. And so if something starts off of Toledo, it's not going to take long for it to be off of Cleveland, because it just sweeps across the lake. And I'll show you some pictures about that later. And then you have the Eastern Basin, which is the deepest part of the lake, but there's rivers in this country that are deeper than that. And the deepest part of Lake Erie is at 210 feet, which is off a Long Point, and that's going to be in the Eastern Basin. But still, it's a very shallow lake, and you have this gigantic 338-foot car ferry that literally disappeared on Wednesday, December 8th, 1909, hasn't been seen since. It's a pretty astounding story, and most people know about it. It is probably the most hunted wreck in Lake Erie, and we were talking about the Griffin last night. Everybody thinks they find the Griffin every year, and the M&B2 has been found multiple times, but it's never been officially released in the public. But here you go. I mean, just to give the scale on this, is absolutely gigantic. It had a really significantly large beam as well. Just a huge vessel. The problem, and here you see the M&B2 bound in some ice, is that, like all car ferries, right, there's an open gate on the aft end. And if you are unfamiliar with the story of the M&B2, it departed Conneaut. It departed about 2 hours late. It departed at about 10:30 in the morning. It was supposed to leave first thing in the morning, and probably if it had departed on time, it most likely would have made it all the way across the lake. However, some delays, and the rest is history, unfortunately. So it was making a 60-mile trip directly across the lake. It's done this scores and scores of times before, and again, due to being 2 hours late, ran into a storm. And there's a lot of theories about where or what happened to the M&B2. I didn't know if I was going to show this or not, but I figured I'd just show it. And the only thing that was recovered, there was 3 distinct pieces of wreckage that were recovered. And wreckage, I shouldn't say wreckage. One of them was lifeboat, was this one. And this was found 15 miles north of Erie, Pennsylvania, after the accident, after M&B2 was lost, and it had 9 sailors in it, and they were all frozen to death. That's the only other thing that ever came ashore.
Wow.
I decided to put this up. I made this for a couple people, and there was a lot of people looking. It's really nothing in here is not public, or is not private anyway. But just to go over, you'll see the most searched areas in those boxes. But the thing I want to show you on is the orange line, which goes from Conneaut directly across the lake to Port Stanley. And it's 60 miles across. M&B2, pretty decently fast ship. So it was 12 miles an hour is what it would make fully loaded with all the freight cars, so on and so forth. So it should have been about a 5-hour run. Again, as I said, it was 2 hours late leaving from port. It ran into a storm. So that's where things get interesting. There are stories from both coasts of Lake Erie, so the north shore and the southern shore. And there's people in Port Stanley and in Conneaut that have stated that the following morning that they have heard the M&B2's whistle. And there are multiple statements from both sides of the lake that people swore that they had heard M&B2, its call. And in both cases, they heard it. Some people even claim that they had saw it, and then they went back a little bit later outside, looked at the lake, and it was gone.
They can't both be right.
Right. They can't both be right. So either they were listening to other ships or making it up. But either way, one coast is wrong on something. And it's possible that both coasts are wrong. So what the route in orange is what the researchers commonly think happened based on theory. So is it possible that they both heard, the horn of the MNB2? I guess it is possible depending on the time. Because again, it's only 60 miles across. So you get about 5 hours. So if you wanted to head south 4.5, 5 hours, you'd be off the coast of Conneaut. So is it possible? It's possible. However, MNB2 left at 10:30 in the morning. And all of these reports from both sides of the lake were from 1:30 to 3 or 4 the following morning. So that means MNB2 was out there for 18 hours, 15 hours, and couldn't get into port anywhere. And there was a pretty wicked storm that was blowing west to east. So based off of the whistles is you'll see where most of the search areas are, and those are going to be in the gray boxes. I think, and I'll get to the bodies in a second because I'm sure some of you have already read that, but the yellow is interesting because a lot of people think that because they heard a whistle off of Port Stanley, that the captain immediately hugged the shore and went right to Rondo. This area has been checked lots and lots and lots and lots of times. And there's theories about port lights not working, so on and so forth. But I find it very hard to believe that a seasoned captain wouldn't know how to get into port. So a lot of people think that he didn't take the yellow course and went directly back to Conneaut and it sank off of Conneaut based off the testimony of one person who claimed to hear the whistle at 3 o'clock in the morning and looked out and the boat was gone. Somewhere it's out there, and it is one of the most hunted shipwrecks in all the Great Lakes. The interesting thing I think that people forget about quite a bit are the 3 stars on the map. So there are 3 different shades of pink, and the one that's just directly north of Erie, Pennsylvania, is the one where the yawl boat that I showed you a picture of. That's an actual picture of the yawl boat after the bodies were recovered. That's where the 9 men were frozen to death, and it was found 3 days after the MNB2 went down. So fast forward another 4 months, see all the way at the other end of Lake Erie, the eastern end, outside of Buffalo, is where the first mate body was found. And then you'll see almost a year after M&B disappeared, so 10 months, 10 and change afterwards, the captain's body washed ashore on Long Point. But besides that the yawl boat, no other wreckage ever appeared. And then the only other thing was the discovery of those 2 bodies, and they were significantly delayed. I mean, just imagine, even if the M&B went down off of Erie, for a body to float all the way into Buffalo and make it into a Niagara Falls power plant, it's pretty significant. So, but those are the 3 things that people know about. There's a couple different theories. A lot of people have searched, again, off of Port Stanley, and a lot of people think it's off Conneaut. I personally, being a understanding that this captain was pretty seasoned and knowing that the captain had his aft end literally wide open, it would make sense for the captain to head west and to go into the storm in lieu of having the seas wash over and into the M&B. If it goes over, if it goes into the cargo area, it's going to go down. It's going to put the boilers and everything else out. So I think the captain knew that and probably headed into the storm just to try to save the ship longer. And it wouldn't surprise me if it's found in the Central Basin somewhere. It's going to be one of those things when it's found, everybody's going to be like, oh yeah, it's one of those things that was most obvious and somehow was overlooked, right? I mean, that's how it always is, right?
Hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, it should be like, oh, it's right there. We should have looked for it, and it never did. But it's going to be one of those things where I think that's found. But it's pretty amazing that it's going to be the largest shipwreck in Lake Erie. Still haven't been discovered, considering how shallow it is. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting story.
Erik, was she loaded with railroad cars when she was lost?
Yeah, she was loaded with 30 cars.
a
hearing
couple other
a variety of
instances
different things. Yes.
where cars have
She was weighted down. Yeah, she was weighted down. And there's a couple people I've heard, divers, and they said that they found railroad cars on the bottom of Lake Erie off of Port Stanley. So in very shallow water. So I find it very hard to believe, and we're talking less than 70 feet, that a ship with a 58-foot beam when in 70 feet of water, it's almost impossible. But again, like the Griffin, right? Everybody said that they found it at some point. So
yeah. So the other here on Lake Michigan, when we've had car ferries that have been lost, two of them, the train cars broke loose in one instance and bent the Seagate because they were rolling around on the deck.
yeah, is that the Milwaukee?
Yeah, the Milwaukee, and then of course the 18, I think, just had sort of a freak leak. I think she struck a bridge abutment coming out of Ludington, and then damaged her propeller, her stern propeller. But yeah, the MB2 is just a mystery, and you did a great job of reviewing. Actually, I've never studied it in depth, and this is fascinating. You could see why it's such a mystery. This has got to be one of the most difficult shipwrecks to research and make a search grid for on the Great Lakes.
It is, for sure. And I think there's, and as you know, being, an expert in books, and there's a lot of quote unquote historians that have written books about different wrecks, including the M&B, but they're novelized a lot. And that adds to the lore of it as well, right? And that it shouldn't, but that still fuels the fire of adding more mystery to it and kind of getting the facts and fiction skewed a little bit. So that doesn't help the cause, but it's pretty amazing story, and it's a really great mystery, and it's one that I hope gets solved soon. And plus, I just love to dive on it. I think it'd be absolutely fascinating.
Well, I've been asked to take a look at it as my lost ship of the month, and I'm almost reluctant in a way because I'm a neophyte to it. I mean, I know the basic story, but there's so much information now that it would almost be hard to revisit. But in any event, it's a great book. I hope that, and I have no doubt that it's going to be found someday, especially as magnetic anomaly data starts to become more widely available.
Sure.
I think that it's going to be found in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it will too. And with the amount of people that are actually looking for it actively, seasoned explorers, and even the ones that, that are just getting into mag technology and buying their own portable, side scan sonars, it's just a matter of time. So,
or fisherman's going to run it over, right?
Or that's the other thing too, right? Snag a line. Yeah.
A hummingbird.
Right. No, exactly. But it's a great story. So
it is so cool. Well, one of the things that we were talking about, and I didn't realize we were both involved in, was the what's known as the Dunkirk schooner. So a lot of people probably aren't aware of this story. It's kind of a Lake Erie story in some ways, but there was a really cool find made in 170 feet of water of this beautifully intact schooner off of Dunkirk, and I was approached. And I won't go into a lot of detail because it was many years ago. This would have been, maybe 15 years ago. I was approached by a company, a for-profit company, to see if I could identify this vessel. And I came up with a short list, and I gave them my research results and washed my hands of it. Never thought of it again. And I was talking to Erik last night, and I found out he was involved in it too. So I was kind of fascinated by that because we both had our own ideas of what the ship is. So Erik, why don't you tell us about the Dunkirk schooner?
Yeah, it was amazing. It was kind of like the mob, right? We all there was such a small group of people that were involved in it, but nobody was told who else was involved or what their extent was. So it's a pretty interesting story. But so the Dunkirk schooner, you'll see there, obviously the depth's 170 feet. It's called the Dunkirk schooner because it was found off of Dunkirk, New York. It's also known as Schooner G because a lot of the wrecks that are located as soon, when they're unknown or when they're first discovered, they are given a letter. So Schooner G, Schooner X, which was later identified as the St. James, which is another awesome ship in Lake Erie. And this is also known as the Admiralty wreck. Admiralty wreck because there was headlines all over the Great Lakes about this wreck in the fight to raise it and identify it. We were talking about last night about some of the possibilities of the wreck, and I listed at least 4 or 5 of what you had as well in my book, and independently, not knowing that you had researched that. So I was actually kind of proud that I came up with some of the same lists that you came up with. There's multiple wrecks. There's multiple ships, I should say, that this could be. I'm just going to propose to you one, and I'm not saying that it is, although my friends, 2 of them that were intimately involved in this, really wholeheartedly believed that the Dunkirk schooner is this vessel, which is called the Caledonia. The Caledonia whether it is or not, it's a very cool American story. It's an American hero story, and we need heroes now more than ever. So I'm just going to tell it. And I'm not saying that the Dunkirk schooner is the Caledonia, but it's a very fascinating story to tell. You can see here it's 2-masted, right? There's a yawl boat in the stern. Very, very low railing, which gives an indication. And you can saw from the previous slide that there was a tiller. It was tiller steered. So it's very early construction on the Great Lakes. And this is probably going to be one of the earliest ones in Lake Erie that's been discovered thus far. And I am having excuse me 1 second. I'm having an issue with PowerPoint. So the Caledonia, if it is the Caledonia was a ship that fought on both sides of the War of 1812. So it was a British ship and it was an American ship. So it was built by the British, and they're one of the earliest groups of American commandos, Marines, literally crossed the river and went into Fort Erie, started a fight with the British, commandeered this vessel, burned another vessel, and sailed it into Lake Erie.
Wow.
This went on to be an integral part of the Battle of Lake Erie, which was in the War of 1812, but the Battle of Lake Erie happened in 1813. And if you're looking at this very, very old lithograph that I pulled out of the Library of Congress, you'll see Commodore Perry's vessel in the middle. Just to the right of that is the Caledonia. And the Caledonia is also listed just underneath the yawl boat where the gentleman is standing up. Just underneath him, you'll see the Caledonia's name. So a lot of people believe that this is the Caledonia. But either way, absolutely fascinating history that it fought on both sides of the War of 1812 that helped win the Battle of Lake Erie, which, of course, helped get the Great Lakes from the British. And it also, if it's true, it disappeared for about 2 years, and it left Erie, Pennsylvania in 1816 and went on to found what was then known as Fort Dearborn. And for any of you history buffs out there, you will know that Fort Dearborn became the city of Chicago. So not only did the Caledonia help win the War of 1812, it also founded one of the greatest American cities, or one of the great cities of the world. And then it disappeared. And this is where it kind of gets into a mystery. Some people said it changed its name to the General Wayne. Some people said it was just stripped of all identifiers, and it sailed out of Erie, Pennsylvania for quite a while, where the owners helped escaping slaves into Canada, in which case it would have been part of the Underground Railroad. So it's a pretty amazing ship. Any one of those 3 is pretty fascinating, but to have all 3 of them is pretty astounding. So this wreck was actually first located by Gary Kozak in 1976. So I wasn't even born yet. And you can see the mast are still standing. And this, for everybody that knows of the Dean Richmond, which is one of the most hunted shipwrecks ever in the Great Lakes, Gary, that's what he was looking for, because at this point in history, everybody thought that the Dean Richmond was literally a treasure ship. And that's a whole nother topic for another day, which is very, 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 very fascinating. But when Gary was looking for the Dean Richmond, which was a package freighter, he came across this, and which he called wreck number 5. He ended up discovering over 30 shipwrecks looking for the Dean Richmond, and he looked at it and saw that there was 2, mast still standing, and said, "Hey, that's not the Dean Richmond. Dean Richmond was a package freighter. That's not it," and just left it. About 15 years ago, there was a for-profit company, as Brendan said, that purchased these numbers off of Gary Kozak and then went down and saw what I'll show you next. There were multiple artifacts that were taken off of this. Some human remains came out of this as well, but they were bone fragments, also mixed with fish bone when they were coming out of the dredge. But some of the other things that were found here were fragments of Bibles. There were also some ornate women's jewelry, which is pretty interesting that they were on there. They also found some pamphlets or mini booklets on other sorts of religious paraphernalia. It's pretty amazing what they found here. But they also brought up a watch and they brought up a coin, so they know that it went down at least after 1829. But for those who will not be able to dive on this, this is what she looks like, and she is absolutely gorgeous. So she rested 170 feet of water. This is Lake Erie. If you haven't been in Lake Erie, it's green everywhere. Off of Cleveland, it's brown, but in the eastern basin, which is the deepest part of the lake, it's all green. And this is what Lake Erie looks like all the time. Visibility at 170 feet, absolutely phenomenal. Sometimes on this wreck, you'll have easily 80 to 100 feet of visibility. Wow. Which is very astounding considering the ship, Brendan, as you know, is only 80 feet long. So you can literally see stem to stern. You see the bowsprit or the bowsprit, however you want to pronounce it, is broken off and it's off to the right. It's a figurehead just there off to the bow. On the far side, on the port side, there's an anchor. It's just an absolutely outstanding wreck. But everybody will see, if you look at the railing, just how low it is. It's a very, very early construction, but it's a very, very fascinating wreck. This is just an amazing, amazing photograph that Steve Gatto, he's one of the world's greatest wreck divers. Steve was garnered a lot of attention. He was the one that recovered the helm with Andrea Doria. Steve's a dear friend of mine. He's one of the best underwater photographers in the world, and he helped on this project with some of the other people that Brendan and I know. But it's a very, very cool photograph, and you'll see both masts are still standing, and they're still standing today. Very, very, very impressive wreck. You see some of the zebra mussels, but very, very impressive. And here's the stern. This is what's interesting about it. And if you look at if you look just forward of the forward mast, you can see the bowsprit off to the side still. So you're 85 to 90 feet of visibility in this photograph. There's the rudder. The whole port side is basically open, and you'll see a couple different things I want to point out here. Is the stern gallery windows, a rare feature on vessels in the Great Lakes a lot. I like looking at this wreck and diving on it, because you just imagine, it's something like out of the Pirates of the Caribbean, right? I mean, this is typically where you would see that, right? You can imagine the captain looking out these stern gallery windows, looking out at the lake. But you'll notice the port side yawl boat davit is still intact. The right is missing. The yawl boat, which is also known as the lifeboat, is missing, but the left lifeboat davit is there. Very, very impressive. This is Jeremy Bannister. He's a photographer out of Erie, Pennsylvania. I really, really like this photograph. I think he did a great job. You'll see all the way to the right, you see the diver at the bow. So, again, almost 80 feet of visibility, but he did a very, very good job. You see the tiller, and the diver in the middle is just over the very low profile cargo hatch cover. The boards were removed. They were allowed to excavate, and they were given an archaeological permit by the state of New York. But the tiller was accidentally removed, but it is adjacent to the tiller. The tiller is still on deck there, but you can still see caulking between the boards. Absolutely phenomenal. But it's a great story, and it's a great American story, and it's a great story about heroes and what these guys did to commandeer the ship from the British. I always got a kick out of it. We may never know what it is, but there's a couple of good possibilities. If it's not the Caledonia, another one that's really good, and Brendan, we were talking about this last night, is a Pennsylvania. It's very, very close. And there's a couple of other ones. A lot of people have thrown around General Harrison. I don't necessarily believe that one, although it was on my short list as well. But it's one of those mysteries, and it's one of those that we just, it's known as Schooner G, or the Dunkirk schooner, because we just don't know what it is. But hopefully at some point somebody will be able to positively identify that wreck, because it is a pretty fascinating history. Even if it's not the Caledonia, those other ships have good histories, but the Caledonia is a very, very cool story that most people have probably never heard of, but are familiar with Oliver Hazard Perry and what he did for the Battle of Lake Erie. So I just wanted to share that.
That stern gallery is so unusual. I remember that now. That was one of the big things that makes everybody think that's a really early wreck. You just don't see that on Great Lakes vessels.
Yeah, you don't. It's very, very rare. If it is the Caledonia was built in 1797 to 1799, so very, very late 18th century. There's some stuff on there that would be early 19th century construction, so it's probably somewhere very early 19th century if it's not the Caledonia. But those stern gallery windows are very, very, very rare, as you just alluded to. So, but very impressive nonetheless.
Yeah, what a fascinating site. Yeah, like I say, I came up with the research and I gave him my list and was done with it. And I did it anonymous. I actually did it anonymously. I'm probably not supposed to talk about it, but I think all that stuff is all long gone.
Yeah.
All right. Well, one of the things that the way I knew about you was through your books, obviously, and one of the more interesting ones that caught my attention was about the Boland. And you and I talked about this, a heck of a story, one that inspired you to write about it. It was so interesting. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write a book about this, and tell us what happened.
So the Boland is one of my favorite wrecks in Lake Erie. It's superb. I'll show you some underwater photos, and I'll show you some pictures of the inside that most people have not seen or don't go into. I have some of those as well. It's a really remarkable story, and for anybody on here that's seen me live, I always, in the intro to my talk, I always tell you that in one of my most requested presentations is called Lost Tales of Death and Survival. And it's really about the human factor, about what these people did and how they survived and how that will was and how they fought and just what happened to these people, right? Because it's not just a wreck, right? It's somebody's grandfather and uncle and father and brother and son. And that's kind of how I've always looked at it. But the Boland is just a fascinating shipwreck, and it never should have happened. And it's just amazing. The Boland was a canaler, and a canaler was, and here's the architectural plans, even though it says Tineville, that was the previous name that it was under. But the Boland was a Canadian flagged ship that was built in Britain, but sank in American waters. And it was built in 1928 in the middle of the Great Depression. Most of the shipbuilding companies in the Great Lakes were shut down, but John J. Boland Jr., which is pretty amazing that you can name a ship after yourself. Which I always got a kick out of that as well. He got a bunch of money together and says, hey, there's a need for getting goods into Lake Ontario, because as Brendan knows, at this point in the history, right, if you had these giant ships of pulpwood or coal or whatever it was from the upper lakes, and you came all the way down, you came down the St. Clair River and the Detroit River, and then you came across Lake Erie, you couldn't get these big ships. There's two ways to get into Lake Ontario, right? One of them is Niagara Falls, which a ship can't go over, and the other is this, which is the Welland Canal. And it doesn't look like that. I'll show you a picture of actually what it looks like. So, but before the Welland Canal was built, these giant ships that had all these things from the upper lakes would go to Buffalo. They would unload, or in Port Colborne, they would unload, and then the goods would be transported across land, usually by rail, and then they would be put in smaller boats and they would go onto Lake Ontario. So engineers came up with the Welland Canal, and this is what she looked like in 1930. And you can see very windy, very tight, and these giant ships couldn't do that anymore. So Boland and Associates came up with the term canalers, and this was built in England during the Great Depression. They were one of the shipbuilders that was still open, and their phrase was, it was built by the mile and cut off by the foot. And every single one of these ships was exactly the same. The only difference was the name. And so they brought these back, and it was originally named Tineville. He changed the name to in honor of himself as soon as it came back into Canadian waters. And it disappeared for 4 years. No accidents, no collisions, no groundings, no nothing. And then it left Erie, Pennsylvania, or I should say it arrived in Erie, Pennsylvania, very early hours, just after midnight on October 4th. And captain was in a pilot house. They loaded the ship. And in Erie, Pennsylvania at this time, it was loading with coal. Not one person aboard the Boland was permitted to load the ship themselves. It had to be loaded by the dockmen, which I thought was very interesting. The ship was loaded with 3,115 tons of coal. It was a mixed batch, so it was some very large chunks, some very small chunks, and then there was coal dust as well. The ship was loaded to its maximum draft in port, and then they decided to put an extra 400 tons of coal on the deck. They did not tarp it. They did not secure it. They literally just put it on the deck, and they put it in between the cargo holds in shapes of pyramids, and they left port. They did not batten down the hatches. They didn't cover any of the hatches. They didn't do anything. As soon as they got out past the Erie light marker, captain went to bed. As is notorious in Lake Erie, the weather report for that morning said occasional light rain, and apparently occasional light rain meant 48 straight hours of storms. Gets out across in the middle of Lake Erie, and the captain is who's sleeping just underneath the pilot house, wakes up, told to come to the bridge, and he goes there. And for whatever reason, at this point, the captain decided that even though the Boland was taking waves from the stern, he changed the course, so it was taking more. It was hitting more on the weather was hitting more on the port side, which is very interesting. Which caused, as anybody knows, right, it causes it to roll a little bit more. A very, very long story short is that the Boland was hit by 2 successive rogue waves, and they were giant waves. The first one hit the Boland, and the Boland tilted about 15 degrees to the starboard side. There were 2 lifeboats here. One was on the starboard side, one was on the port side. The order was immediately given to abandon ship without stopping the engines and without stopping the propeller. So as the ship was going in the storm, they never stopped. And as people were in the water, the propellers were going as well. And 4 minutes later, another giant wave hit, caused it to go down to 35 degrees, and then it flipped over. There were 4 people lost. One, as you can see there from the headlines, female G. McIntyre. She was recovered in a fishing net several days later, but there were 3 bodies that were never recovered, and they were the oilers in the engine room gentlemen, and I'll get back to that in a second. But these guys, it's a pretty amazing story what happened with the lifeboats, and I don't have time to go into all of it, but there were some of these survivors floated for 32 straight hours before they made it to shore, which is absolutely remarkable. Somebody had that much stamina in an October storm to literally weather the storm, no pun intended, and still survive. And this is what she looks like today. So it's a very cool wreck. It's not all the way turtle. In turtle is wreck diving language, or wreck diving speak for, being totally upside down as a turtle shell. She's not totally turtle, but I figured here what I'll do is I'm just going to basically take you guys on a virtual dive of what it looks like coming down the anchor line. I'll take you inside the ship, and then I'll just bring it all the way back around. But this is what the ship looks like coming down the anchor line, which is attached to the rudder post. You see a giant 4-bladed prop. This is going to be one of the first things you see coming down as you make contact with the wreck. Now it sits at 137 feet. Visibility here is typically 60 to 100 feet, so you can see this, from pretty far away coming down the anchor line. But it's very, very, very impressive. Giant 4-bladed prop. This is another one of Jeremy's photographs. It's very, very impressive. And I wanted to include it for him tonight. He did a great job. And you notice one of the things about the Boland is there's an open railing system all the way around this. So as the coal was going back and forth, as the weather was going back and forth, there's no scuppers, there's nothing, there's no bulwarks, there's nothing to keep the weather, being the water, from coming on board at all. It's an open railing system all the way around. So this is the stern. This is going to be the aft side. See a couple open doors where the diver is. I'll show you those in a little bit here, but you'll see the two lifeboat davits basically in the dead center of the picture, and that is the port lifeboat. And just underneath that is the engine room, the glass for the engine room. This is another one of Jeremy's photographs here. So now we're kind of moving towards the center of the ship. You'll see the first of the 6 cargo holds, and you can swim these cargo holds all the way. You'll see the door is open. This is where the after crew, which would be the oilers and the engine workers and the engineer, this is where they would live. And this is where the crew mess was. And you can access that, and you can get into the engine room through here. It's a decently dangerous, for lack of a better word, penetration dive, but it's not too terrible. You can see the bollers in the upper right, just above the open cargo hatch. This is what she looks like on the inside. Sometimes you're following somebody to go to the engine room. So this is why I study ship plans, and this is why I have the civil plans in a Boland. Just because if visibility gets like this, I want to know where I'm at, and I want to be able to get out safely. Here's a picture of the engine room. Giant engine. There was rumors, and it always was, and I even had this in my first book, that there were 3, and this was propagated through stories from early on for 70, 80 years, that there were 3 crewmen that were lost in here that never made it out. But I pulled out the original testimony that I found in the Canadian National Archives at the end of last year. It was 240 pages of testimony directly related to the loss of the Boland. And it states that all 3 of them were oilers and firemen, but they made it out. They jumped in the water, but they just drowned. But this is a very cool picture of deep inside the wreck. Here it is. In the lower left of the picture, you'll see the glass there, and that is how you would get some air into the engine room. So if you don't want to penetrate from the engine room, you can kind of peer in a little bit over there. But this diver's going underneath the elbow davit. It's one of my favorite pictures. Just fantastic. Moving a little bit forward now in the sea of green. This is one of the cargo holds looking out at a diver. This is the forward superstructure, and you'll see a lot of ladders, a lot of ironwork, a lot of open railings, railing systems, so on. So you see a door there. Believe it or not, that door still works. The hinges are still on it, and you can actually still operate the door. That is the same door as the previous slide, just looking in, and you can see the bow all the way to the right. And this is inside that picture of where I just showed. This would have been the captain's areas, where the captain's quarters were. Captain also had an office, and he had his own bathroom in here, which had a toilet and a tub. The crew had their own bathroom, and they shared quarters, and they shared a different bathroom in a different part of the ship. You can see the original caulking in between the boards, and this is a case of which way's up, which way's down, right? So the ship is almost turtle. So the floor is actually to your upper right, and the ceiling's to your lower left. But again, you got to pay attention to where you're at inside the wreck. But a very, very neat shipwreck. And then coming out, usually everybody will make the swim back to the stern, and this is kind of where we started. So, but it's a pretty neat wreck, and this is actually one of the wrecks, and this is what garnered a lot of attention, because this is 20 years after Titanic. So it doesn't seem like that long, but it was 20 years of Titanic, where there weren't laws against overloading your vessel with cargo or whatever it was. So it was, as the court called it, a pernicious custom. So it happened all the time, right? Because the more people you loaded on the boat, the more cargo you had on your vessel, the more money the company and the captain made. So it took another shipwreck, very similar to this, that happened a few months later. And after that, they actually changed the laws in the Great Lakes that you could not overload your vessel anymore. But it was due to this wreck. So very neat history of it. But it's a cool dive. But this wreck ended up saving probably countless hundreds of lives, just by the way they redid the laws after this wreck.
Wow, that's an amazing story. I think we're gonna start to wind it down though after that. The couple of questions about it. Do you know when it was found?
It was found. You know what? I do not remember.
That's all right.
That's a good one. I'm stumped on the first question. It's so terrible.
I don't know either.
I don't recall when it was found.
Do any of our viewers know? Maybe they'll answer. So I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about your latest book, this Lake Erie Technical Wreck Diving Guide. I've recognized the picture on the front.
Yeah,
is one we just talked about. Tell us a little bit about the book and how we can get it.
Yeah. So here's my first book, Shipwrecks Lake Erie Volume 1. It's just a tale of stories. It's going to be stories like this, these lost tales of death and survival. I'm writing Volume 2, so I'm kind of debuting the cover here tonight for you guys. So this is the mock-up of what it's going to look like. But this is the latest book I have on a Boland. So Lake Erie Technical Wreck Diving Guide. Yeah, you can get this on my website. It's also available on Amazon. This is just encompasses all the deepest. There's 19 of the deepest wrecks, over 130 feet in technical diving range. There's full histories on each of the wrecks, color photos, historical, archival, so on and so forth. The thing I'm most proud of this is the cover. I designed the cover. I really, really like it. It's the Boland there. But it's, this was picked up by a publisher in Oxford, England. They believed in the project so much that they bought the rights to it. And plus, Gary Gentile, who's the world's greatest wreck diver, wrote this about this book, which I really was super stoked about. But Gary also said this to me after he wrote that. So because of that, you should buy the book. But yeah, you can get these on my website. I also write tons of articles for Wreck Diving Magazine. I'm one of their regular contributors. I do a lot for Joe and Heidi, and they do a lot for me. We work together. They are the National Geographic of dive magazines, as I like to say. They're having a little bit of trouble right now due to this COVID stuff. And obviously the dive industry has been hit very hard, as everything is. But, without advertisers, because they have no money, they're not in production right now. So I'm giving away free ebooks to anybody who buys a couple of their back issues, and you can get some at Wreck Diving Mag. Here's my contact info. You can order any of my books or get in contact with me if you have any questions. But that's how you get in touch with me. So
very cool, Eric.
That is that.
Well, thanks so much for showing us this. Some really great stories, particularly the Boland. I didn't know much about that wreck, to be honest with you, because I'm over here on Lake Michigan. But man, that is a heck of a dive site with a heck of a backstory. Probably one of the most compelling wrecks, both to learn about and to visit on the Great Lakes. Just astounding.
Yeah, it is. It's a great wreck, and it's a very cool story. So, yeah, that's why I really wanted to write the book about it.
And one of our viewers says Gary Kozak found it, apparently.
Yeah, he found. Okay, there you go. Yeah, not surprising. Yeah, he's found just about everything in the Eastern Basin anyway. So, yeah.
So, again, thanks so much for being with us tonight. What a great show, and amazing wrecks, and really good pictures too. So I appreciate you coming out and showing us everything you did. A couple of housekeeping things. Just want to remind everybody that we have Mark Sprang coming on next week from the Historical Collections for the Great Lakes at Bowling Green State University. He's going to be telling us all about their collections there. And after that, Valerie Van Heest from Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates. So don't miss that one. That's going to be a real fun talk with Valerie. She and I have worked together on many things over many years. And again, a couple of new features on the website. research challenge. So take a look at that if you're a researcher and you want to help solve an enduring mystery of the Great Lakes. The current one that's up there is the schooner Blackhawk that vanished on Lake Michigan in November of 1847. Or did it? We're trying to figure that out. Many authors, including Radigan and Bowen, both say that she's one of these enduring went missing, with all hands, vanished ships. But we're reinvestigating that because there's evidence that she may not have. So please help us if you want to. The winner gets a copy of Captain J.B. Green's Diving With and Without Armor from me. So, all right. Well, Erik, thanks again. Thanks so much. I'm sure this won't be the last time we chat or that we have you on the show. So,
well, thanks. I appreciate it. And thanks for everybody showing up. I had a good time. But hopefully you invite me back. If not, hey, it was only an hour. But I appreciate it. Thanks. It was good meeting.
Long before we start recycling guests. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Have a good evening, and don't forget to come back next Wednesday. Good night, everybody.